Hey guys, so today we're going to be labeling the skull. We're going to start with the bones, and then we're going to move into sutures, and then lastly we're going to cover some of the more distinctive processes that you're going to see throughout the skull. So, starting with bones, this is your frontal bone. Here is your parietal bone. And if you flip the skull around, you have your sutural bones and your occipital bone. From a side view, you have your temporal bone. This kind of funny looking L shape is your zygomatic bone. Your sphenoid bone sits right behind the zygomatic bone. And then if you take a peek into the eye socket, it might be kind of hard to see. You're going to have your ethmoid bone right here. This very thin bone right next to it is your lacrimal bone. And your nasal bones are going to sit right above your nose. So below your nasal bones, you're going to have your maxilla. And the last bone on your list should be your mandible. So next we're going to move into sutures. Between your frontal and parietal bones, you're going to have your coronal suture right here. And then you're going to have your sagittal suture right here. Your lambdoid suture is going to cut across the back. And your squamous suture is going to be on the side. The last suture you need to know is right here. It's your occipitomastoid suture. And that should be easy to remember because it's right between your occipital bone and your mastoid process. So now that we've gotten through bones and sutures, we're going to move into some of the more distinctive structures of the skull. So coming to a side view, we're going to start with the zygomatic process, which is actually a protrusion of the temporal bone that extends to meet the zygomatic bone. It's right here. The next structure we're going to look at is also on the temporal bone. It's called your mandibular fossa. And it's this little indent right here where your mandible is going to come up and meet your temporal bone. And right next to this indent, you see this little bump right here below number 6 is called your articular tubercle. So the next thing that we're going to look at is your external auditory meatus, and that is right here in this little hole. After that, we have your mastoid process, which, like I said, is right next to your occipitomastoid suture. It's the bigger, bulkier process. And then after that, we're going to have your styloid process, which is this little thin pointy process right here. So next we're going to move on to structures that are easier to see from a frontal view. We're going to start with your glabella, which is right between your eyes. Next, we have your supraorbital margin, so the margin right above your eye. The name kind of gives it away. As well as your supraorbital foramen. If you can see this here, it's this tiny notch right on your supraorbital margin. Next, we have your superior orbital fissure. If you take a look inside of the eye, you're going to see 2 indents. So the first one is up here, and the second one is down here. So your superior orbital fissure is this hole right here, this upper hole. And your inferior orbital fissure is this lower hole right here. Your optic canal sits right above your superior orbital fissure. It's this little hole right here. And your lacrimal fossa is number 40, if you can see that. It's that little hole right in your lacrimal bone. So coming back to the front, your infraorbital foramen is the hole below your eye. Again, the names do a lot to give it away. You're going to have your middle nasal concha here and here, and your inferior nasal concha here and here. And those are going to be separated by your perpendicular plate right there. So next we're going to take a closer look at the jaw and some of the processes that occur on the jaw. So this is your mandibular body, this whole area, and this whole area is your mandibular ramus. Your coronoid process is the front bump that you see right here, and your mandibular condyle is this larger bump that you see in the back. These are separated by your mandibular notch right here. And between the mandibular body and mandibular ramus, you're going to have your mandibular angle, which is basically the margin right here. So looking closely, number 52 right here is your mental foramen, this tiny little hole. And taking a look inside of the jaw itself, you're going to see another tiny hole, and this is called your mandibular foramen, excuse me. So both sides of your mandible come together in what's called your mandibular symphysis, right there. So now we're going to go ahead and take a look at the bottom of the skull. You flip your skull over. We're going to start with this largest central hole right here. This is called your foramen magnum, and it's where your spinal cord is going to leave your skull. So it's really important. So surrounding your foramen magnum, you're going to have two larger bumps called your occipital condyles. And kind of hidden, but behind these occipital condyles, you might be able to see this hole right here, is your hypoglossal canal. So coming back to a purely bottom view, we have, to get more acquainted, your mastoid process. You remember that from earlier. Your styloid process. Remember that's this pointy one right here. And your stylomastoid foramen, which sits right between your mastoid and your styloid. So taking a closer look at some of these holes, let's see if we can get a better view. There we go. This is your jugular foramen, this larger hole right here. And on top of that is going to be your carotid canal, this hole right there. Coming a little bit farther up in the skull, you have your foramen lacerum right there. Your foramen ovale is the larger hole, and your foramen spinosum is this tiny hole below your foramen ovale. So one more thing you can note, if you remember from earlier again, your external auditory meatus is right here, right next to your mastoid process. So up here you're going to have your vomer. You're also going to have your incisive fossa right here. And if you remember seeing earlier, your inferior orbital fissure, which you come back up here, you can see down here. So that should cover everything for the bottom of the skull. So we're going to move from the bottom of the skull, actually inside the skull. So if we could take a saw and cut off the top and actually look down inside of the skull from a bird's eye view, this is what we would see. So a lot of the structures that we're going to label inside are very similar to the ones that we were labeling from the bottom of the skull because the holes are extending through the bones. But because this is a completely different angle, things are going to look a little bit different. So it's important to kind of run through them here as well. So I'm going to start with the foramen magnum again. And then we're going to move to the hypoglossal canal right here, which, if you remember from the bottom, sat right below your occipital condyles. Your jugular foramen is, again, this larger one right here. And just like we had our external auditory meatus, we also have an internal auditory meatus right there. Next, we're going to take a peek at our foramen lacerum right there, our foramen ovale right here, and our foramen spinosum, this tiny little hole that sits right below the foramen ovale. So it's pretty neat. Inside of the skull, you can actually see your superior orbital fissure right there. Right below your superior orbital fissure, you're going to have your foramen rotundum, that little hole right there. And above it, you're going to have your optic canal. So your cribriform plate is right here, and your cristagalli is going to sit on top of that. And one last structure that's pretty neat is your sella turcica.